Welcome to another edition of Clearing a New Path podcast. Today I have with us the Rural Development Network folks. Sydney Stenikis is the Director of Homelessness Initiatives with the Rural Development Network, and Mary Maguire is a Project Manager with the Rural Development Network. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.
First question is a pretty easy one. What is the Rural Development Network here in Canada? What do you do, and whom do you serve?
Yeah, the Rural Development Network. We were formerly the Alberta Rural Development Network. So we actually originated or started back in 2009. And we were essentially a partnership of Alberta's post secondary institutions. And really, they wanted to connect better with rural communities. And so we essentially acted as that bridge. To date, we still have 8 post-secondary institutions on our board of directors, which is amazing. And so we do continue to conduct research and partnership with the colleges and post-secondary institutions. We do a lot of community-based research, but I would say we've really evolved over the years and support rural communities with a number of capacity building projects and research. And we've also created a number of networks, which we'll be happy to share more about today. I think in terms of the shift from the Alberta Rural Development Network to the Rural Development Network, when we rebranded back in 2020, was because we were finding naturally we were connecting with folks outside of just Alberta. Of course, we have really strong roots here in Alberta, and you'll hear more about those today. But we were getting very similar questions, hearing about similar challenges that were going on in rural communities around, social issues. And yeah, we just found ourselves naturally working outside of Alberta, and it started to become a little confusing for folks with when we had Alberta in our name. And so that's ultimately it really was an organic process, us working nationally, but it just became a bit of a barrier to have the Alberta in our name. So that's why we ended up dropping the Alberta. So in terms of our work to date and what that is comprised of, so we have a few core programs and initiatives, although I will say that a lot of our work has evolved over the years based on community needs and priorities. And so that's one thing that I really love about RDN is we really do listen to the needs of the communities and really adapt the services and, the research that we're offering based on what communities' needs are. So as of right now, really our core initiatives are our housing initiative, which really focuses on supporting communities with that pre-development work. And again, be happy to share more about that initiative later on. We have our homelessness initiative, which we deliver federal homelessness funding through the Reaching Home program. We do a lot of community education and awareness and training. We support communities with data collection. And then we also have our rural immigration initiative, which really focuses on supporting rural communities, businesses, service providers with creating inclusive and welcoming spaces for newcomers in their community and really supporting them with retaining them in the long term. So that's a little bit about us from a high level. Mary, did you want to add anything at all? Was there anything I missed?
I don't feel like you did. I think maybe and you might have said this, but part of the work we do is really, like Sydney was saying, based on community need, or at least that's what we try to prioritize. And so some of that includes more specialized projects related to age-friendly initiatives and, working with rural women's shelters across Canada and supporting them with streamlining policies and procedures. So yeah, we kind of hit different pockets of initiatives related to more social development as well. But they're kind of just special projects that pop up here and there based on what we're hearing from the communities.
Can I ask
Thanks, Mary.
how you end up working with communities? Do municipalities reach out to you? Are there organizations that reach out to you, like the women's shelters in rural communities? Do they reach out to you? How does the funding?
The Shelter Pulse Project, for an example, that was really based on a casual conversation between our then CEO and a leader in the gender-based violence space in a rural community in Alberta. And essentially, it was just a conversation. It was an existing relationship they had about how there just wasn't capacity to streamline policies and procedures or to even have them updated, especially during the height of COVID. But so much administrative work really takes second place to that frontline first
Mhm.
responder type work. So So really it started off as a very casual conversation, and then a curiosity was born out of that, where the CEO at the time then reached out to various other shelters across Canada to understand if this is in fact something that is needed for many shelters as opposed to just that one conversation. So oftentimes I think we do have our existing relationships and we carry them forward beyond the project. And then as things come up, if we see funding opportunities come up from, maybe the federal government or the provincial government, we could then reach out to those relationships and see if if it'd be something they'd be interested in partnering with us on again. So that's one way it takes place for us, or they reach out to us saying, hey, we see that this opportunity is coming up. Do you want to work on this together? So, Sydney, I don't know if you wanted to add some more information on that or your perspectives.
When a community, expresses interest in working alongside our organizations, again, we're a nonprofit. We are not, consultants at the end of the day, but we do a lot of grant funded projects. And yeah, you'll hear more about those today. But it's essentially it really is dependent on the community. But again, because we're really community driven at the end of the day, we don't want, um, of course, we're, an organization and a nonprofit, and we need to keep the lights on at the end of the day. But really, we will work with the community to figure out solutions around the financial barriers, because we certainly believe in the work and want to be able to help as many communities as we can. And did we talk about who we serve? Did you mention that as well, Mary?
You go ahead.
I did
You go
not.
ahead.
Okay. So typically, we do work with a lot of, I would say, municipalities. We do support town councils, their administration. I would say predominantly we work with their administration. We do support a lot of service providers and community based organizations who are working in the spaces of housing, homelessness, and settlement in smaller communities. We also do work in partnership, especially through our Reaching Home program and some of the work that Mary has done with a women's shelter in the Northwest Territories. We do work with Indigenous communities, First Nation communities, Métis settlement communities here in Alberta. So that's been, I would say, also in terms of an evolution of our organization. We had an incredible team a few years ago, a First Nations led team, do some work specifically with First Nations communities around data collection. And we as a non-Indigenous organization have made a really intentional commitment to reconciliation. And although we are not Indigenous, we do see ourselves as there being a really important role for us to play as allies to Indigenous communities and really promote for Indigenous by Indigenous projects. And also, for example, for the funding that we administer, the federal funding. We've looked at ways to decolonize the way that that funding is administered, for example, through the development of oral application and reporting processes to really respect the culture and storytelling that Indigenous communities and really love to share and things. So yeah, I think that was just one other thing I wanted to add in there, because yeah, we do really, as a non-Indigenous organization, we've really tried to be intentional with that commitment to reconciliation and are still exploring ways of what that can look like through our work as we partner with more Indigenous communities.
I think there are some urgent issues in rural communities. I mean, each community, as you know, as you do this work, is unique. However, there are some common threads right now, and you're tackling some of those issues. Do you want to talk about some of those initiatives that you are part of, that you're doing research on, or that you are actually implementing with specific communities?
Absolutely. Maybe I can kind of kick things off and then I'll pass it over to Mary, but maybe we can start with our homelessness initiative. Obviously, homelessness is a pressing issue that many rural, remote, Indigenous communities are facing across the country. We've seen an increase, especially in invisible homelessness traditionally, or what we typically see in smaller communities, and this still is the case today, is that more hidden homelessness. So those folks who might be couch surfing, sleeping in their vehicles, staying in abandoned buildings, or maybe who are at imminent risk of becoming homelessness. They're that one missed rent payment away from losing their housing, or maybe they're living in housing that doesn't have access to sufficient heat or electricity or even clean and safe drinking water. And while it's certainly the case in a lot of the smaller communities we work with, we've also seen a number of rural communities see an increase in unsheltered homelessness. So those folks who are sleeping or staying in public spaces outside. We've seen an increase in the number of encampments and encampment responses in rural communities. And so it certainly is a huge issue, and one that we've been seeing, and even our previous CEO, Deanne Bernard, would agree. I mean, it's been an issue for years. However, I think there's more awareness and just more visibility to the issue than ever before. And so one of the ways that our organization is supporting communities with responding to homelessness is through our Reaching Home program. And that is federal funding that we receive to distribute out to rural, remote, and Indigenous communities in Alberta. We're able to fund a diverse range of projects and activities through this funding. We're able to support capital costs associated with emergency or supportive housing, which is really great. And we largely see a lot of folks reaching out for support with operational funding. So, for example, we fund a number of outreach worker positions, housing liaisons, community support workers or navigators. So, folks who can really help us support folks navigate the really complex systems when it comes to accessing income assistance or employment, et cetera. And we also support a number of prevention because obviously it's really important to be proactive. And if we can keep people housed, it certainly goes a long way. And, the less, folks who are ultimately experiencing and entering into homelessness. Yeah, through that program, we've been able to see really some amazing success stories come out of that initiative. Certainly not enough funding to respond to the need. Very grateful for the federal government's continued investment into that program. But our organization, we do continue to advocate at all government levels for more funding for rural, remote, and Indigenous communities to respond to the issue. So that's a little bit about Reaching Home. Maybe I'll pass it over to Mary to share a little bit about the work that she's doing within the homelessness space.
I think that another area, or at least I guess a pressing issue, and it seems to be a consistently pressing issue across rural communities in Canada, and remote, is just having the capacity and resources to fund, develop, and implement any sort of programming. And really, that's another pocket that we get involved in, is supporting communities in just accessing funding, letting them know about what funding exists, and also being, maybe subject matter experts, for lack of a better way of putting it, in areas that they might not have capacity to focus on. So, if I'm using an example of the Women's Society I was working with in Northwest Territories, they're in the middle of looking to actually have the physical shelter built, and just needed additional support with the policy development, and that the infrastructure around forms and processes and job descriptions, right? So that's sort of where we were able to come in with our knowledge and with our existing networks in the shelter space, to really support the development of all those things and support the writing of them all. And so, yeah, I think that that's a big piece of our work. Like, how can we really fill in those spaces and those gaps in communities in terms of that implementation of project work, to keep things moving and keep their programs running and sustainable? I think another thing, another pressing issue, is aging populations as well, social isolation of that, especially in smaller communities, aging in place, being able to stay in the community that you know and you love. And, there's just sometimes not the infrastructure in communities to keep older adults in where they grew up, or maybe where they've settled, right? So, really working with communities, we've done a chunk of work in working with some rural communities in Alberta in age-friendly action plans. Again, we did some work as well in dementia inclusive initiatives to support some organizations in implementing them in their community, and then also initiatives around ageism. So creating campaigns around who are the older folks in the community, and amplifying how they are obviously still meaningful parts of the community as well, and sharing their stories. So yeah, I think those are big ones for me: aging populations, and of course, capacity and resources are areas we certainly can continue to support communities with.
And I wanna ask, just like on a kind of fundamental level, we have what's called the Rural Women's Resource Center here, and that is a women's shelter in Middlesex County where I live. And so if that organization wanted to work with you, how do they do that? Or if there is a senior center that is looking to fund some programs, or some ideas, or needs some help with policy, or needs some help with, how do they contact you? Do they just email you? And then do they have to have money in order, like, do they already have to have funding in order to even engage with you?
No, no. So all really folks have to do is send an email, our general email, info@ruraldevelopment.ca. And from there, it gets filtered out to folks who are maybe more knowledgeable in those certain areas. So for older adults, maybe that email will be filtered off to me. And then that's when those discussions start. But certainly it would never involve any sort of transaction of money or what have you. It just is really about hearing about what's going on in their community and then going from there. Because then maybe we know of certain funding that's available, or, we can have those discussions about, okay, this is an issue you're faced with right now, or this is some programming you're looking to beef up or develop. Let us take that away and sleuth around and see what sort of funding is available provincially or federally, or even through private funding opportunities or through other organizations. And then we go from there.
Okay. Rural immigration is a big topic also, and I know that you provide funding and support for that. Has that evolved? I mean, during COVID, we know a lot of people pushed out from the metropolitan cities, and then suddenly there are more people, more diverse people. Perhaps these services weren't available at the time. How do you assist those communities in those sorts of initiatives? How has that evolved?
So for our rural immigration initiative, certainly it's a really interesting time. Of course, you had mentioned earlier there's definitely policy, changes coming from the federal government. And what's been really amazing to see with this team and this initiative is, regardless of what's might be happening, at the government level or at the policy level, this team continues to work in supporting rural communities with creating welcoming and inclusive spaces for newcomers. And I think certainly in many smaller communities, newcomers make up a significant percentage of the labor force. I'm thinking of even in communities including Jasper or Banff, temporary foreign workers comprise a large percentage of the seasonal work and the tourism industry. And so what they've been seeing and what that team's been seeing is communities are still reaching out. I think just in the last couple months alone, there's been a number of municipalities reaching out because they are wanting training. They do want to better support newcomers in their communities. And so our rural immigration team really focuses on providing training to employers, to service providers, to elected officials, really the general community, on how giving them practical tools and how they can create these welcoming, inclusive spaces, how they can honor, and make sure that, for example, that a family community and support service organization has, intake forms that are in, the language of the newcomers who predominantly comprise that population. So there's many different ways, and not every, what I love about, again, RDN and about this team in particular, what works in one community might not work in another community. Our rural immigration team offers many incredible trainings. They're actually working on developing a training right now through their WARM project, which stands for Welcome, Attract, Retain, and I think Motivate communities to create welcoming and inclusive spaces for newcomers. So certainly if folks are interested, they can reach out to our team and we can connect them. They're going to be delivering some of these training series, I believe, in the new year to communities. And this training is free. This is funded through a grant that they've received. And they've also provided, it's called Ready Training, but it's essentially supporting with rural communities, employers, and businesses. And again, considering that so many newcomers comprise the labor force in smaller communities, helping businesses really create welcoming and inclusive spaces, and just also providing information, around cultural context for some of these newcomers who are coming from different communities. We've seen a number of smaller communities as well welcome Ukrainian refugees into their community. And so we've developed some trainings and tools and resources to support folks with who are looking to support with housing Ukrainians in smaller communities, and as well as service providers who are working so closely to support them with their needs. Our rural immigration team's lovely. I wish they could be here today, but they are, yeah, they're phenomenal and they're doing some really great work in this space.
I'm going to come back to you, Mary, but I really want to talk again about homelessness. It is a many-pronged issue. Homelessness in rural communities is complex. And you mentioned about you're funding this program in Alberta, but there's homelessness everywhere. And so is there funding available also for other provinces, or how can they work with you? Is this a pilot? What's happening? And what are some of the prongs of the very complicated beast?
Great question. So for reaching home specifically, it is the federal government's essentially homelessness strategy aimed at reducing and preventing homelessness across Canada. So although our organization delivers funding in Alberta, there are community entities like us located in other provinces and territories across the country, which is amazing. And folks are having trouble finding information online on who they should be connecting with in their community. We're absolutely happy to play that role as a connector. We've actually been hosting just this past year what's called a community entity roundtable, but it brings together the other organizations from across the provinces and territories who are also delivering reaching home funding to have conversations around homelessness, to have conversations about how the funding is distributed, how we can better share information and resources with another. And so certainly there is funding out there through reaching home. We also, you had mentioned, Shauna, that you live in Middlesex County, and we actually just finished up a project with Middlesex County in the past year, working with Joe over at the municipality, and specifically looking at supporting them with developing a homelessness communications plan. So, homelessness it's a massive issue, and we certainly acknowledge it should be tackled as a shared, it's a shared responsibility to tackle the issue. No one municipality, no one level of government can do it alone, and so we really believe in bringing folks together and leveraging resources, leveraging knowledge, leveraging funding to better support local responses to homelessness in the community. But I will say, like, it's been incredible to see what rural communities have been able to do across the country just in with the limited resources that they have, whether it's setting up a temporary winter mat program to support folks in getting out of the cold during the coldest times of the year. Or we've seen in Alberta in Whitecourt, there's an organization, Soaring Equal Support Society, that's turned an old motel and converted it into supportive housing. And there are others looking at, adopting similar models. And I think our organization can play a really critical role in connecting communities to one another, because at the end of the day, we don't want folks to have to reinvent the wheel. There are solutions out there that are working in communities. It's just about making sure that folks have access to that information and are aware of what's going on. In terms of like other homelessness funding, every province and territory works a little bit differently, but there certainly are provincial responses to homelessness, and especially rural homelessness going on across the country. So definitely encourage folks to, again, whether it's reaching out to our organization or connecting with their provincial or territorial government to see what opportunities there might be. As was mentioned earlier, our organization also plays a role in connecting folks to other sources of funding beyond reaching homeless.
I love that. I love that you can connect folks to that. And do you help with the actual funding applications? Do you help with that? You do.
Yes,
Okay.
our housing team actually probably does the most work in this area because they are the experts when it comes to applying for capital funding for housing projects. And so whether it's, our housing, homelessness, or immigration team, it's certainly an area that we're able to support with. In the homelessness space as well, another pressing issue is the data gaps that exist when it comes to understanding housing needs and homelessness, or as we like to say, housing insecurity.
And Mary's working on an exciting project. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now, Mary?
Yeah, totally. So I'm working in the homelessness space, housing and security space as well right now with the research and engagement project. So it's a project focused on understanding the experiences of Canadian Armed Forces veterans and RCMP veterans, specifically like that space as they transition out of service and back into civilian life, and what might be some risk factors or things that possibly could contribute to them experiencing housing insecurity and homelessness. Again, with a very special lens around that rural and remote and Indigenous community experience. We are in our first year of this project, so it's been very much focused on understanding the issue and really condensing or I guess synthesizing the information to understand what is happening in the rural context of it all. Because there's lots of information always in terms of the urban experience of things, but where it gets tricky, where data is really important and those stories is in the rural communities. And so, what we're hoping to get out of the research and the engagement we're doing in the new year with service providers in the homelessness and veteran serving space is to understand what are those gaps and supports and how can advocacy in the space and the data we're collecting through surveys be something that could advocate for maybe beefing up programming, having more knowledge sharing in areas related to RCMP and Canadian Armed Forces. So, yeah, I have a really great advisory team right now made up of former members of the RCMP and Canadian Armed Forces veterans across Canada and all the way from like Labrador to Kelowna, BC. Like literally we're across coast to coast here. And so they've been really supporting the guidance of survey development, what community engagement looks like, and even certain gaps in areas I would not have ever thought about because I do not have the lived experience. So, a neat little side note there is considerations around understanding veterans' experiences in trying to attain housing or renting when they are former RCMP or Canadian Armed Forces, because sometimes there's stigma attached to that as well. People make a lot of assumptions about who veterans are and how they may present themselves post service. There is sometimes negative narratives about policing and RCMP. And so sometimes there's even certain communities that RCMP or former members of RCMP for that matter might not even feel comfortable in living in because of maybe some misunderstandings or some worldviews about who they are, right? So, but yeah, it's been very interesting. It's a new space for Rural Development Network, the veteran space, not homelessness. But yeah, it's been really great so far. Very, very interesting.
So is there a connection then to legions? Like the Royal Canadian Legions? I can't imagine that they wouldn't be. I mean, that's got to be it's a real focus point for most communities, rural small communities.
Mhm.
There is at least a legion, right? Like in a lot
Yeah.
of them.
Yeah. Yeah. So legions are certainly a pathway for folks to connect to resources. Where the issue really seems to be, or maybe where folks might fall through the cracks, is really in that support of paperwork. That paperwork is then going to get you access to your benefits and other supports through Veteran Affairs. And so they're just, at least so far, in the research and in conversations. So, anecdotally, in a couple of conferences I went to, one of the things that continue to come up, one of the themes I'm seeing is really about your transitioning out of service, possibly going through like a major identity disconnect, a bit of a crisis there. You could be carrying some trauma from some events that happened in service. You could have physical injury, all sorts of things, right? You're coming out of very structured, especially for Canadian Armed Forces, very structured place, and you're out into the world, and then you have all this paperwork, and you're already overwhelmed. You don't know really where to start. In some cases, folks don't even want to look at the paperwork. It's very onerous. And I even think, uh, Veteran Affairs support workers, caseworkers are very aware of this piece too, right? Like they completely understand that it can feel overwhelming. It's like this necessary evil to get connected to services, but it is a very difficult stage in their lives. And then it's
Mm.
kind of compounded with these other things that they need to navigate. Looking at possibly creating more of a robust system in supporting folks with systems navigation and for filling out forms and what have you is something that I've been taking away from this experience so far.
Interesting. So as you're
Mhm.
speaking though, I think very much about it's very similar in the paperwork part to folks that are new to Canada,
Newcomers.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Meaning
Yeah, absolutely.
they are coming perhaps from major trauma. They perhaps are coming from having a doctorate or, a very professional job and having to fill out forms and their first language isn't English, perhaps, and trying to fill out job applications for a Tim Hortons in their rural community. And
Right.
needing support for that. There are so many folks that need the support with the paperwork.
Always.
Seniors in particular, but also youth, young folks, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
looking for their first job. You don't go into a corner store with a resume anymore and say you're so and so's kid, right? You just don't do that. That
I know.
is not
It's so
the
true.
rural community anymore.
Yeah.
That is not the reality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's a benefit to that, of course, because nepotism, but
Mm-hmm.
it's just a very different process for everyone. And so all of the supports that you're providing are really interesting. And I hadn't considered the veterans. Definitely there is a technology gap with certain populations as well. And I don't want to generalize. However, the access perhaps to the technology isn't as prominent in rural communities as it perhaps is in a urban center. And so even that can be a struggle as far as accessing resources of any sort.
Yeah.
And like the technology, like internet, where you have to go to your local library to get a really good connection, uh, or apply for a job, or, any of those things. There's a job board at our library. There is someone who comes in and helps people with their resumes, that sort of thing. The physical part of it, being at a location is difficult in a rural community. We're in winter. So, maybe somebody has to drive 20 kilometers to get to the closest internet connection or to sit and talk with a job expert or any kind of support. So you're attempting to fill in a lot of those gaps and gather the data in the process. Yes?
Yeah. And you're really kind of exercising my brain a bit because Sydney and I have been talking about this a lot just around approaches in community development in these smaller communities and how it's so important that on the outset, you really understand the community. You
Mhm.
understand like what are those barriers? Who are the folks who are very involved in communities? So if there is a need for transportation to something, whether it be information session or whatever sort of thing we're bringing to community, like the beauty of small communities is people rally. They all know each other, not all, but you know what I mean. There is a different kind of connection sometimes in these smaller communities. And so it's so important for us to learn who these folks are, learn what the culture is there, create an environment that is informed by them if we're looking to work with them, right? And you're right, transportation is always a big deal. Understanding what that's going to look like, what sort of funding needs to be allocated to that. Seasons, like it's not just the weather, but it's also I think about the territories and specifically Inuit communities and like when is hunting season? When is fishing season? How do we work around those times so we can connect, right? Or, sometimes you are connecting while they're hunting. That happened for me before too. And I'm on the phone with somebody and they're in the middle of hunting and it was like super windy in the little hamlet they're living in. And we just did, I was like, hey, I'm cool with doing this if you're cool with doing this. So you just make it happen in a way that feels good for the community, in a way that is a part of the way the community moves. So as you're talking, it was making me think about like, like I was saying, Sydney and I had been having so many discussions about asset-based community development. So like, that's the formal term we don't typically use. Understanding what are the strengths and assets of the community and building upon those to make programming possible.
And actually letting the community lead, meaning, what do you
Yes.
need and how do we fill in the gap?
Hmm. Hmm.
Because there's a degree of
Absolutely.
pride also, right? There's a degree of pride, but there's also a little resistance, I would say. There can be resistance from the municipal level. From a municipal leadership perspective, it is, kind of, well, we're doing fine. We have these
Mm.
services, we don't have any gaps. You don't need to do that. Okay, well, let's find out.
Hmm.
Let's find
Hmm.
out from the folks who need the services
Yeah.
what gaps they have.
Yeah. And I think that's the other piece of it is leadership and knowledge holders, influencers, they aren't always in these formal positions, right? Whether it be on council or what have you, right? And I think that you only find out who those people are and who can help influence. Maybe it is the municipality or what have you, as you get to know the community, and sometimes it is just like maybe you start at just looking at social media. What's the presence there? Who's talking? Who's being most engaged and rallying folks to do things, right? And so sometimes it could be that simple, and in getting to know folks and reaching out to them. And like I said, sometimes they reach out to us, right? And then if you nurture those relationships, and I think that's the one piece, we always kind of keep in the back of our minds, like, sure, our project wrapped up. There's no, like, I guess, financial linkage between us, no deadlines, but we like to keep those relationships going. Like, I still talk to folks that I worked on projects with 2 years ago, and we still have calls here and there. And maybe we're not talking about work and we're just catching up, about life. So just having real relationships with people. It's just like human to human work, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I think that that's really, really important. It's not about them. Everyone is a human being behind each story, and
Yeah.
each story is unique. Each community is unique. And I think you hit the nail on the head with the influencer thing, where, who's the people that are bringing folks together or starting initiatives from scratch or have they have the ear of lots of folks in the community. Yeah, it's a very delicate yet beautiful dance to do with members of the community. Is there anything else either of you would like to add?
For the our housing and service needs estimation program, that was actually essentially we yeah, well, the project or program we were hearing from many rural communities that the point in time count methodology, which is traditionally used in a lot of urban centers to capture the number of folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, was not necessarily capturing that hidden homelessness population in rural communities. So that population that isn't as visible. And so what we did was we developed at the time a guide to estimating rural homelessness, it was called. And really, that program, just seeing the evolution, at least even since I've been at RDN over the last 5 years, has been really incredible. And really, it aims to address those data gaps in rural communities. So it looks at folks along the entire spectrum of housing insecurity and homelessness and provides communities with data to better understand, yeah, what people's housing experiences are, what the service needs and gaps are in the community. It does a bit more of like a comprehensive dive, and it really gives, and my favorite part about this work and this program is it really amplifies the voices of those with lived experience of housing insecurity in not only understanding what the issues are, but also then in understanding how we can move forward with developing solutions. And I think that it's so important to have those voices at the center of this work. And yeah, it's a really great program. We have done some work outside of Alberta with it as well, having conversations with actually several provinces right now about what it could look like doing doing some of this data collection work in their communities. But yeah, certainly a program that I think is going to be continuing to grow and expand over the years. And it also can complement point in time counts, because it's not to say that methodology that's used by the federal government, it's really important to have data that is comparable at the end of the day. It's but this data can really complement some data that comes out of other methodologies. So yeah,
Can I ask you
that's
really quickly about the stories that you said that you're amplifying?
mm.
You're collecting stories, but how are you amplifying them? What is that process?
I should have specified with this housing and service needs estimation program. So really the methodology behind it is it's a survey that is distributed out through the community through a lot of service providers and non-traditional partners as well. We have had, restaurants, um, just schools, community hubs also participate in helping facilitate and administer the survey. And so community members are invited to complete the survey. And then what our team does is we essentially compile the information, share it back with communities. And our amazing housing and service needs estimation team, Emma and Cash, what they do is they work to put together essentially what they call like community profiles of what a typical person in the community who's experiencing housing insecurity would look like. And it's to protect confidentiality because we do need to respect and protect the confidentiality of the folks who are participating in these studies. But it gives the elected officials and council and even the service providers just insights into okay, what does a like not a day in the life, but what does the life or experiences of a person in their community typically look like? And it really helps to dispel some of those myths too of what typically folks experiencing homelessness go through, and or the folks who might be in the position of experiencing housing insecurity. It may be your next door neighbor, someone you had no idea who might be, doesn't have access to sufficient heat or electricity, right? Or maybe it's someone down the street, a woman and, her child fleeing domestic violence. It's really, yeah, these community profiles. That's really what I think has been awesome at amplifying some of these stories, again, while respecting confidentiality in community, because that is so important, especially in small rural communities. It can be really easy to kind of decipher or pick out who that person might be. And so that's just one of the ways. And of course, sharing these stories and sharing this data with all levels of government to help inform decision making and policy and funding decisions and allocations has been a huge goal of the program as well.
I like that. That's amazing. And yeah, anonymity is really important in a rural community because, I mean, you could see the person at the grocery store or in front of the grocery store, right? Anytime. Mary, your turn.
Just to bounce off that quickly, that duality in relationships and in roles, it's so much more of a thing in smaller communities. And so it's always important that we consider that as well. That, Wendy down the street might be accessing support services from, I don't know, Michael, who's her next door neighbor and works at an organization. So always keeping those things in mind and in the various things that we do at communities as well. And I think, like, overall, it's so important that we keep these conversations going about rural, remote, and Indigenous communities, smaller communities, especially when it comes to the storytelling and the data collection. I think that is really it's the evidence that communities can really leverage to get funding they need, or at least to plead a case, right? And
Mhm.
and I think again, and I know this word is used a lot, but I just always want to emphasize how resilient and creative small communities are. There's just so many champions in the community that come about when any sort of issues arise, sorry. And I think it's important for us to tell those stories or to support communities in ways to tell those stories through data and through engagement. And yeah, I just really wanted to cap it with that.
Thank you both so much for the work that you do and for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Shauna.
Shauna.